It's actually this week's Parshas Omer, has the mitzvah, Svartim lachem mimachares Shabbos. You shall start counting from the day after Shabbos. We'll come back to that in a moment. Miyom haviachem es Omer hatnufa. From the day that you bring the Omer that is waved. Sheva Shabbosais Temimais Tiyana. For 7 weeks you shall count. Ad mimacharas haShabbos hashvius, and until the day after the 7th week, you'll count a total of 50 days. We count 49, and the day after is Shavuos. Vikravtem mincha chadash al Hashem, and you shall bring a new mincha for Hashem. So I want to go over just the pasuk in Chumash to be sure that we understand every single part of that pasuk. You shall start counting the day after Shabbos. What does it mean, the day after Shabbos? So this was a huge machlokes for hundreds of years between the Tzedukim and the Perushim. The Tzedukim are the Sadducees, and the Perushim are the Pharisees. Again, according to our understanding, the Perushim are Chazal, and the Tzedukim were a movement that did not believe in the Torah Shebaal Peh and interpreted the Torah Shebichsav in a very literal way. Why are they called Tzedukim? Because the founder of that movement was a fellow whose name was Tzadok. A little point of information: do not confuse the Tzedukim with the Karaim, the Karaites. The Karaites is a movement that is much later. The Karaites you might call the resurgence of the Tzedukim. The Tzedukim were a movement in the time of the Bayis Sheni, the time of the Second Temple. And by the time the Mishnah was completed, the Tzedukim became extinct. There were no Tzedukim. Now, many, many years later, after the Gemara was completed, in around the 11th century, the 1000s, maybe a little earlier, we then had a person, Anan ben David. It's interesting, he founded a whole movement because he didn't get the job he wanted. He wanted to become the Gaon of Surah, and instead Rav Sadia Gaon got the job. So Anan ben David said, it's an amazing thing, I mean, he changed his whole religious philosophy because he didn't get the job he wanted. I mean, if he would be a Gaon, he would be in charge of teaching Torah Shebaal Peh. But he didn't get the job of Gaon, which was the head of the yeshiva. So he said, I'll start my own religion, which is Karaitism. So Karaim have more or less the same beliefs as the Tzedukim, but they are separated by hundreds and hundreds of years, and they are not the same. There are no Tzedukim today, there are Karaites today. Even in Jerusalem, there are Karaite synagogues, etc. The Karaites have a website, even. So apparently, they're not against any type of innovations, but etc. But I remember years ago in a library, I came across a Karaite Cedar. So what would you expect in a Karaite Cedar? They're not going to have Shmona Esrei, because that was made by the rabbis, the Anshe Knesset Agdola. So they had Shema, they had Psukei de Zimra, and they have their own prayer. So it's interesting, you can't really live without chachamim that guide you. No matter what your religion is, you have to have people who guide you. So when we say, we only look at the Torah Shebichsav, we don't look at the Torah Shebaal Peh, that's an impossibility. What happened was, they invented their own Torah Shebaal Peh. And that became their Torah Shebaal Peh. But be it as it may, that's the Karaites. Maybe we'll spend some time talking about them another time, but do not confuse them with the Tzedukim. But the Tzedukim took the position that if the Torah, and the Karaites, by the way, followed this position, that if the Torah says you start counting the Omer the day after Shabbos, they say Shabbos means Saturday. And therefore, they believed you always start counting the Omer the first Sunday after Pesach, after the first day of Pesach. So actually this year, we're in agreement with the Sadducees, right? Because it happened to be our day and their day would be the same. But that's a coincidence. So according to the Tzedukim, the counting of the Omer always began on Sunday, because they interpret Shabbos to mean Saturday, and Mimacharas HaShabbos means Sunday. That also means, according to the Tzdukim, the holiday of Shavuos is always going to be Sunday, right? You understand that the 50th day is always going to be the same day of the week as your starting point. Like this year, Shavuos is Motzei Shabbos, Sunday. In fact, some say that the reason why the Tzedukim's position was so popular is it gave everybody a guaranteed 2-day vacation. This is a problem in Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, we don't have the second day of Yom Tov. So it turns out that when you have a Yom Tov, it's only one day, you don't get 2 days of vacation. This year we got 2 days of vacation because this year we didn't, but Shavuos will have 2 days of vacation. Yeah, Pesach we didn't. So what do the Chachamim say? The Chachamim say that the meaning of Shabbos in that pasuk does not mean Saturday, but Shabbos is a designation for the first day of Pesach, because Yom Tov can also be called Shabbos, because it is a day of rest, a day that you're not allowed to do malacha. So machlokas number one is, what does Mimacharas HaShabbos mean in terms of when you start your Sfira count? Does Shabbos mean Saturday and counting of the Omer begins on Sunday? That is the position of the Tzdukim. Or does Shabbos mean the Yom Tov of Pesach, and Mimacharas HaShabbos means the next day, which is the second day of Pesach, no matter what the day of the week is? And the Gemara in Menachos points out that this was a machlokas between the Tzdukim and the Prushim that went on for hundreds of years. And the Chachamim went to very great lengths to communicate the idea that Shabbos in this pasuk does not refer to Shabbos Bereishis, which is Saturday, but it refers to Pesach. We will discuss later, not today. So why does the Torah use the word Shabbos? That's a very good question. Why doesn't the Torah say Mimacharas HaPesach? Right? Why does it use a term that is so confusing that you could follow the mistake of the Tzdukim? Okay, we'll leave that. But be it as it may, that's our starting point. You start counting the Omer, Mimacharas HaShabbos, the day after Shabbos, and Shabbos means first day of Pesach. Now, then it gives you another indicator. Miyom haviachem es Omer hatnufa. Your starting day is the day, in fact, this is where you get the word Omer, the day that you bring the Omer offering. So, again, like the Tzdukim, that would be the Sunday after Pesach, like the Prushim would be the second day of Pesach. So what is Omer? So if you remember in the Torah, Omer is a volume measurement, and Omer is actually given in the Torah as the amount of man that fell every day. In Parshas Beshalach, when the Torah talks about man, it says every person had an Omer legulgolas. An Omer, a measurement of an Omer for each person. So Omer is a volume measurement, like a bushel. Now, how much is an Omer? So an Omer is said to be the volume of a little bit more than 43 eggs. In fact, Omer is very, very, very relevant even today, because that is the size of a dough from which you must take off challah. Now that translates, depending on computations, to between 2.5 pounds of flour to 5 pounds of flour, but strictly speaking, Omer is a volume measurement, and it happens to be the sheer challah. Okay, so what was the Korban Omer? On the second day of Pesach, an Omer of barley flour was brought to the Beis HaMikdash. Barley flour. It was mixed with water, etc., and oil, And like every mincha, part of it was burnt on the mizbeach. That's called the kamitza, the fistful. The rest of the Omer was baked as matzah, and it was consumed by the Kohanim. That is called the korban of the Omer. Everyone understands this. This is a mincha offering, barley flour. It is the only mincha that's barley. All other minachos in the Torah are wheat. Chazal actually say that since Pesach is freedom, and you haven't yet gotten to Shavuos, freedom without Torah is animal freedom, and barley was given to animals. It's only once we have Torah that we have menachos of wheat. Okay, this is the Korban Omer. So what does the Torah say? The Torah gives you two starting points for this mitzvah of counting the days. One is Mimacharas HaShabbos, and the other is from the day that you bring the Omer offering. In our tradition, both are the same point, the second day of Pesach. More generally, what was the purpose of the Omer offering? So the purpose of the Omer offering was to take off an Isser in the Torah that is called an Isser of Chadash. Chadash basically means the new grain that grows in the new year cannot be eaten until you bring the Korban Omer. Because again, think about this. Generally speaking, the earliest part of the harvest season in Eretz Yisrael is right before Pesach, or around Pesach. That new grain is called Chadash. Chadash cannot be eaten until the Omer is brought, meaning technically the matzah that we had Cedar night had to be from the old grain, not from the new grain, because Chadash is not mutter until the Omer is brought. Now, what does that mean? Today, there is no Korban of Omer, so how could we ever eat grain? I mean, the grain is forbidden until you bring the Omer. It's forbidden forever. Chadash, I mean, all grain is Chadash. Grain cannot be eaten, in Eretz Yisrael at least, until you bring the Omer. Today we can't bring the Omer. How can I eat grain? So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah explains that the requirement that you can't eat Chadash until you bring the Omer only applies when there's a Beis HaMikdash. When there's no Beis HaMikdash, it is the passage of the date that matters the Chadash. Now, that actually means the morning, there's still an Isser Chadash. I cannot eat Chadash until the morning of the 16th of Nisan. And even though we didn't bring the Omer, when there's no Beis HaMikdash, it is the coming of the morning that matters. And then we have a takana of Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, who prohibits it for that entire day, so you can't eat it until the end of the 16th of Nisan, and meaning going into the 17th of Nisan. Okay, so this is a din of Chadash. Now, whether it applies outside of Eretz Yisrael is a huge, huge machlokas, but certainly for the grain of Eretz Yisrael, there's an Isser of Chadash. Bizman HaMikdash, it was the Omer that mattered it. Shalo Bizman HaMikdash, it is the day of the 16th of Nisan that matters it. The Oraisa, that would be the beginning of the day. Midrabanan, a takana of Yochanan ben Zakkai, is you have to wait until the end of the day. Okay, and whether it applies to Chutz La'aretz grain is a big, big machloket. Mainstream American hashgachas like the OU do not give a hashgacha that something is not chadash. They're somech on the Ramah, who permits the eating of chadash in Chutz La'aretz. But more Mahadran hashgachos are careful about this, and you can even get guides, what's chadash, what's not chadash. Now, this part of the year, you don't have a problem of chadash, because it's right after Pesach, so everything that's here was already covered by the passage of the day. Okay, this is the purpose of the Omer. Okay, now let's go further. Sheva Shabbosais Tamimais Tiyana. You have 7 weeks, and then you count 50 days. and your Shavuos, and at the end of that time, you bring a mincha chadasha l'Hashem. Now, what is mincha chadasha? Now, mincha chadasha is not referring to the Omer. The Omer you brought at the beginning. Miyom haviyachem es Omer at nufa. Mincha chadasha is another mincha that you bring on Shavuos. And this involves what are called shtei halechem, 2 loaves of bread. And these are breads that are made of wheat rather than barley. And interestingly enough, they are chametz rather than matzah, which is unusual because menachos throughout the year are normally only matzah, even not during Pesach. Shtei halechem is chametz. We'll talk more about this, but why is it called mincha chadasha? Why is it a new mincha? In what way is it a new mincha? So the Mishnah in Menachos explains a very important rule. The bringing of the Omer maters new grain for human consumption, but the bringing of the Shtei Halechem maters new grain for Korban Minchas. In other words, until the Shtei Halechem, any mincha you bring in the Beis HaMikdash has to be from last year's grain. You need a matir. You need something that matirs the bringing of chadash. Omer matirs the consumption of chadash. Shtei halechem matirs the sacrifice of chadash in the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so these are the 2 bracketing, right? The korban ha'omer, the korban shtei halechem. So the Torah basically is telling me between these 2 korbanos, you go through a process of counting. And this is colloquially called the counting of the Omer. Although the counting of the Omer actually makes no sense as an expression. Omer is a volume of barley flour. The counting of the Omer. So you understand that this is kind of a made-up expression. This is not an expression the Torah uses. Essentially, Omer means a measure of barley. It has now become the name for the period between Pesach and Shavuos. So we call it counting of the Omer. But you understand, counting of the Omer is analytical. I mean, I say it too, but it's analytically not a correct, it's a nonsensical expression. Counting of the Omer. Yeah.
And why do we put it in the bracha? Sfirat Omer.
Yes, Sfirat Omer. Yeah, that's a good question. I'll actually address that in a moment. Okay. So now, number 1, what is the purpose of counting the Omer, or counting this period of time? What is the goal? So the Sefer HaChinuch says, very simply, the purpose is to make a linkage and a connection between the holiday of Pesach and the holiday of Shavuos. By counting the days, you are linking Pesach and Shavuos. And why is that important? Because Pesach is the season of freedom. Shavuos is the season of Torah, Matan Torah. And Hashem wants to communicate through the mitzvah of counting the Omer that this is one holiday, not 2 separate holidays. It is Shavuos that gives meaning and purpose to Pesach. This is very profound. People often think that freedom is an end in itself. The purpose of my life is to be free. But that's incoherent. Freedom to do what? Freedom to be what? Freedom is an important idea, but freedom is a means. It's always a means to something else. Freedom has no inherent value or purpose, except insofar as it enables you to achieve what it is that you want to achieve. Erich Fromm, happened to be Jewish, he was not not religious, who was one of the Talmidim Muvhakim of Sigmund Freud, who also happened to be Jewish. But Erich Fromm once remarked that we make a very big mistake when we talk about freedom from something. We have to look at freedom towards something. Freedom to be able to pursue a certain goal. And Chazal said it much earlier. That's why Chazal say the korban of Pesach is barley, the korban of Shavuos is wheat. At least before the invention of cholent, barley was primarily fed to animals. Wheat was human food. What is the Torah telling me? Freedom without Torah is the freedom of a wild animal. With Torah, it becomes human dignity. Sa'orim to chitim. I may have mentioned this before Pesach. The Vort of the Yishbitzer, great Hasidic Rabbi, Rav Tzadok's Rabbi, that this is why Ashkenazim have the minhag at the Cedar that they eat a hard-boiled egg. It's not a chiyuv, but it's a minhag. Many eat a hard-boiled egg at the Cedar. And one of the reasons that the Yishbitzer gives is a bird, unlike a mammal, is born in two stages. The bird lays an egg, the egg is laid, and then the egg is hatched, as opposed to a mammal, which is a live birth. The premise here is that Klal Yisrael is like a chicken. We were born in two stages. Yetziat Mitzrayim was the birth of a nation, but it's only stage one. Stage two is Matan Torah. That we don't consider freedom as the end stage. Freedom is a means to the end. And that's why we connect it to a bird. We are like the egg, so to speak, that's born in two stages. So, the Sefer, going back to the Sefer Achinuch says, the purpose of Svira is to link freedom with Torah. That when you don't have Torah, you don't really have freedom. And of course, this could be understood in a lot of ways. If you're simply go with the Yetzer Hara, whatever your taiva is, how free are you? People say, I want to be free. Well, if some guy is rodef after every single taiva, every single negative emotion, are they free, or are they simply being controlled by these forces over which they have no control? How free is a person who doesn't have the ability to control their anger or control their taiva or control their ego? Is that freedom or is that slavery? Tagore, who was an Indian poet, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the, I think, 1920s. And he was not talking about Jews. I don't even know if he knew Jews. Once compared a human soul to a violin string. Beautiful, beautiful metaphor. A violin string can produce exquisite music. But take a loose string, totally free, a free string, unencumbered. I have a string on this table. If I touch it with my finger, what sound will I get from it? I will get nothing. How will the string produce the lovely music it's capable of producing? Only when it's tied down. Paradox. The freedom to express the beauty within can come only when there's submission, only when there's commitment. Total freedom. Nothing will happen. So Pesach needs a Shavuos. The counting of the Omer reminds us that it's one holiday, not two holidays. And that is why, anyone remembers, what is the name that the Mishnah gives to the holiday of Shavuos? It calls it Atzeret. Remember, Atzeret in the Mishnah is not Shmini Atzeret. Atzeret in the Mishnah is Shavuos. Atzeret literally means conclusion, ending, part two. Shavuos, Pesach, one holiday. In fact, that even explains an interesting thing. Shavuos has no official date in the Torah. This is very fascinating. It happens to be Shavuos is the 6th of Sivan. But that's not what the Torah says. The Torah does not say celebrate a holiday on the 6th of Sivan. The Torah says celebrate a holiday on the 50th day from the bringing of the Omer. In other words, Shavuos is the 51st day of Pesach. It's not a calendar date because it's not a separate holiday. In fact, the Ramban even says that the whole period of the counting of the Omer is Chol HaMoed. Now, you got to be careful. If you tell your boss you don't work during Chol HaMoed and you don't show up for 7 weeks, you might get in a little trouble. The job may not be there for you when you come back. But the Ramban writes that Sviras Omer is Chol HaMoed. So that's the significance of the counting of the Omer. Now, again, I want to point out, we'll talk more about this, but I just want you to understand that do not confuse the counting of the Omer with the mourning of the Omer. There is nothing inherent in the Omer period that would make it a sad period. Lahepech. As far as the Torah is concerned, this would be a very happy and joyous period because we're looking forward to Matan Torah. The Avelis came later because of the deaths of Rabbi Akiva's students, and we'll talk about that. But that was kind of superimposed on the Omer period, meaning people sometimes get confused and they think, oh, the Torah says, this is a sad period. And why? The Torah does not say it's a sad period. This is a happy period. We're looking forward to Matan Torah. In fact, even with the mourning, there should be a certain simcha involved in Matan Torah. Okay, so this is the idea of the counting of the Omer to link freedom with submission. Now, the truth of the matter is, Tagori's mashal is true in so many areas, even outside of religion. It's true. Sometimes you listen to a jazz musician, and they do some brilliant improvisation. They do a riff or whatever it is. I'm just using these terms. I really don't know what they mean, but okay. Now, a person says, let's say you're learning to play a musical instrument, and your teacher tells you got to spend the next 2 hours playing scales. And you say, I don't want to play scales, boring, same thing over and over and over, and I want to do something creative. I want to do improvisation. Or you're learning to paint, and you look at abstract artists, you look at Picasso, or you look at Jackson Pollock, you look at, and you say, what do I have to learn technique? I just want to, kick a can of paint on the canvas, and I'll sell it for $10 million. Although I suspect some of these artists actually get away with that. But the answer is you have to understand that before you can be creative, you have to have the discipline of learning a technique, whether it's art, whether it's music. Even in learning, it's that way. Sometimes you can find a person could be a very creative, mechadesh, innovative thinker in halacha. But before they can do that, they can't just come, the first day you're learning and say, I want to say chidushim. It comes with hasmada and yagia and mastery of things. And then you become creative in that way. Okay, so the truth is, it's really almost a truism of life that real creativity also requires a certain discipline. And sometimes we're so impatient. I mean, the difference between a 3-year-old banging on the piano and an atonal musician, although again some would say there isn't that much difference, but many people say there is a difference, is that the atonal musician still had to learn all of that basic stuff. And then he transcended it. Then he went on to a different madrega. But to simply start fooling around, that's narishkeit, that's foolishness. Okay, so this is Pesach and Shavuos, very, very fundamental. Okay, everyone understands. So again, don't confuse this. The mourning is something else that is superimposed on Sfira, and we will get into the reason for that. So what I want to mention today is a halachic point. That is there a mitzvah d'oraisa to count the Omer, or is it only a rabbinic commandment? So let me give you 3 shitos in Rishonim. Most Rishonim, and this is mainly in Taisus and Menachos, actually take the position that the counting of the Omer Bisman Hazeh is only a rabbinic law. Why would it be a rabbinic law? Because the Torah says you start counting the Omer from the day that you bring the sacrifice. Miyom Haviachem Es Omer Hatnufa. Since Bisman Hazeh, we don't have a Beis HaMikdash yet, and we don't bring the Omer sacrifice, then by definition, the counting of the Omer is not the Oraisa, and the only reason we do it is Zecher LaMikdash, to remember what was done when we had a Beis HaMikdash, and in that way we pray for the restoration of the Beis HaMikdash. So most Rishonim say the counting of the Omer is midrabanan. It is not the Oraisa. The main shita that goes the other direction is the shita of the Rambam, Maimonides, who says that even Bisman Hazeh, the counting of the Omer is min HaTorah, that the mechayev of the Omer is not the bringing of the Omer, but it's the second day of Pesach in which you could bring the Omer, had there been a Beis HaMikdash. So it's a big nafkamin, a big machlokas rishonim. If Sviras HaOmer Bisman Hazeh is the Oraisa, or Sviras HaOmer Bisman Hazeh is midrabanan, Zecher LaMikdash. Now you might ask a kasha, which is, you can always ask this kasha, L'may nafkamina? What's the difference if it's Drabanan or Doraisa? You got to do it anyway, that's for sure. So I'll give you one practical nafkamina, and that is, it's more Nogay America, or at least outside of Southern Eretz Israel, you'll see in a moment. How early can you count the Omer for the new day? Now we know in halacha, there's a period of time that is called Bein Hashmashos. Bein Hashmashos is basically twilight. And although it's complicated, but we'll go with the most simple definition, that Bein Hashmashos is the period of time between sunset, which is Shkia, and Seisa Kochavim, the appearance of 3 stars in the sky. Meaning, before sunset, it's Vadai day. Once the stars are out, it's Vadai night. Bein Hashmashos is halachically Safek Yom, Safek Laila. In fact, there are 3 possibilities. Maybe twilight is day, or maybe twilight is night, or maybe at some point in the middle it switches. Halachically, you have 3 doubts about Bein Hashmashos. And generally speaking, that's why you have to be strict. Let's take Shabbos, for example. Shabbos is not 24 hours. We keep Shabbos closer to 25 hours. We must stop doing malacha absolutely by Shkia. And we're not allowed to make Havdalah and do malacha Saturday night until the stars come out. Now the reason is very simple. If Bein Hashmashos is night, I got to stop doing malacha from Shkia because it's already night. But I can't do malacha Saturday night after sunset because maybe it's day. You understand? In other words, if I knew Bein Hashmashos was day, I could do malacha till the stars come out. And if I knew Bein Hashmashos was night, I could do malacha Motzei Shabbos when the sun sets. But because Bein Hashmashos is a suffix, I have to err on the side of stringency, both sides of the equation. Another example of Bein Hashmashos would be a bris. We know that if a baby is born on Shabbos, so the 8th day is Shabbos, we do a bris on Shabbos. What if a baby is born Friday afternoon after sunset, but before the stars come out? Now this is actually a very interesting case because here I have to do the bris on the wrong day. What day do I do the bris? Now, if Bein Hashmashos would be daytime, it's a Friday baby, and I would do the bris on Friday, if I knew that. If Bein Hashmashos is nighttime, it's a Shabbos baby, so I could do the bris on Shabbos. So I don't know if this is a Friday baby or a Saturday baby based on the suffix of Bein Hashmashos. So if it's a Friday baby, it would have a Friday bris. If it's a Saturday baby, it would have a Saturday bris. But I don't know if it's a Friday or a Saturday. So this is an interesting halacha. I can't do the bris until Sunday. Because I can't do the bris on Friday, because maybe Bein Hashmashos is night and it's a Saturday baby, and you can't do a bris before 8 days. I can't do the bris on Saturday, because maybe it's a Friday baby and Saturday is the 9th day, so I can't do that on Shabbos either. So I do the bris on Sunday, even though for sure Sunday is not the right day. Sunday is either the 9th day or the 10th day, but it's the earliest time you can do the bris, yeah.
Is there anything wrong with doing it on the next minute Hashmashot? That way you play it safe, whatever that is. So that way you know it's the right thing either way.
Yeah, theoretically I think you do have a point if you could time it for the exact moment, but again, no, but since Bein Hashmashos could change even in any time in the middle, that's a third possibility.
If you know it's on one side of the middle or the other side of the middle, you just do it the same side.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to switch in the middle. It might switch 2/3 into it, meaning any single moment of Bein Hashmashos is potentially a switch. So the only way you could do it is if you could time it to the second of the exact Bein Hashmashos, and that's probably impossible in that way. Now, let's go back to the Omer. How early could I count the new Omer day? Bein Hashmashos. In many shuls in the United States, they actually daven Ma'ariv before the stars are out. And they actually do count Bein Hashmashos. They count Sfira after sunset before the stars are out. Now here in Eretz Yisrael, Baruch Hashem, because twilight it's interesting that the length of twilight does not depend on summer or winter. It's not longer in the summer and shorter in the winter. It depends on proximity to the equator. Meaning in the equator, there is no such thing as twilight. It goes straight from sunset to darkness right away. And the closer you are to the equator, the shorter the twilight period. That is why here in Eretz Yisrael, where we're a little bit closer to the equator, you will notice it gets dark fairly quickly after sunset. Northern, whether it's London, I'm not talking about or North Pole, I'm even in London, Paris, New York, etc., twilight is a longer period. So in the United States, it's very common in a typical non-yeshiva sheminyan, where they daven mincha and ma'ariv together, that the shul will count the Omer before the stars are out, but Bein Hashmashos, after sunset. So the question is, could you do this? So now let's look at the cheshbon. Like the Rambam, you would not be able to do this. Because since Sviras HaOmer is a Torah commandment, when it comes to a Torah commandment, Safek D'Oraisa, all doubts regarding a Torah law, have to be resolved l'chumra, in the strictest way. So I'm mechuyev to say, maybe Bein Hashmashos is still daytime and it's not yet the new day. So according to the Rambam, you could not count the Omer until Tseis HaKaychavim. Masha'ein Kain, if I take the position that Sviras HaOmer is mid'Rabbanan, I could say, Safek D'Rabbanan, doubts pertaining rabbinic laws, I can be lenient. So I am permitted to assume that Bein Hashmashos is nightfall for purposes of enabling the new count. And since most Rishonim do paskin that Sviras HaOmer is midrabanan, we actually paskin me'ikar adin, you are permitted to count with the bracha Bein Hashmashos, but it's ra'oi and proper for a Yerei Shemayim to either defer not making the bracha until nightfall, Or, the other way, make the bracha and count with the tzibor, but count again without a bracha when it's night, to be yotzei the Rambam Shita. Okay? So this would be the nafkamina. Now, let me just mention, and I'll talk about this Shita tomorrow. So I've mentioned two opinions. Opinion number one, Seviras Omer is midrabanan. Opinion number two, Seviras Omer is the oraisa. That's the Rambam's opinion. Now I'm going to mention a third opinion by one of the Rishonim who was a Talmud of the Rosh. He's called Rabbeinu Yerucham. I don't know if you've heard of Rabbeinu Yerucham, but Rabbeinu Yerucham is a very, very important in halacha because you see the Beis Yosef and the Torah, they always quote Rabbeinu Yerucham. There's some strange superstitious aspects about Rabbeinu Yerucham. They say, I mean, it's brought down in some sources, you're not allowed to learn his book. It's very strange. It's not even clear why this is so. You're not allowed to learn his books. There's a curse on learning his books. Okay, one has to understand that. Part of it is because there were many, many mistakes in the copies of the books. And Baruch Hashem, they've been corrected, and this does not apply. I mean, obviously, Rav Yosef Karo had no problem with learning Rabbeinu Yerucham because he quotes Rabbeinu Yerucham all the time. But you can check. This is like an odd bit of like semi-superstition connected to Rabbeinu Yerucham's Svarim. But Rabbeinu Yerucham has the following interesting shita. And I'll leave the explanation for tomorrow, but I just want to throw it out for you. He says, Pshara, the mitzvah of counting days is the oraisa, and the mitzvah of counting weeks is only midrabanan. Right? We know that in our counting of the Omer, we combine two units. We count the week. Now, the first 7 days, we just count days. But once we're beyond 7 days, every counting of the Omer, the units are aggregated in two ways. So today is what? The 16th day of the Omer. So what did we say? Today is the 16th day, we said it last night, which is 2 weeks and 2 days. And the Gemara says there's a mitzvah to count days, and there's a mitzvah to count weeks. That's the halacha. You have to count days and you have to count weeks. Says Rabbeinu Yerucham, the mitzvah to count days is minat Torah at all times. The mitzvah to count weeks, the oraisa, is only when you have a korban omer, and bizman hazeh it's zecher lemikdash. So the question we'll have to explore is, what on earth is the possible svara for this? I mean, either you're going to tell me the mitzvah of counting is connected to the korban of the Omer, or it's not connected. If it's connected to the korban of the Omer, then today all of the counting is rabbinic, like Tosfos says. Or if you're going to tell me it's not connected to the bringing of the Omer, then everything is deoraisa, like the Rambam says. In other words, you can understand a machlokas. Do I connect it to the korban Omer, or do I not connect it to the korban Omer? But what basis would there be to say, oh, the days are not connected to the Omer, and that's why it's doraisa, but the weeks are? I just want to point out an interesting thing. There's a shtickle remes. Okay, tomorrow, Mir Hashem, we'll talk about the svara for Rabbeinu Yerucham. But there's a shtickle remez in the nusach of some Sfardim that they actually hold like Rabbeinu Yerucham. This is really very, very interesting. Let's say how we counted the Omer. And in fact, most Sfardim counted this way as well. We said, Hayom, Shisha Asar Yom, today is the 16th day, Shem Shnei Shavuos, Ushnei Yamim, Ba'omer, La-Omer, we'll talk about that, but that's a side point, right? In other words, we don't put Ba'omer till the end. Many Sfardim say it this way. Hayom Shisha Asar Yom Ba'omer. Today is the 16th day of the Omer. Shehem Shnei Shavuos Ushnei Yamim. They put the word Ba'omer, not, or La-Omer, again, that's a separate issue, but they put that word not at the end of the whole phrase, but they put it after the days. Again, Hayom, Shisha Asar Yom La-Omer, Shehem, Shnei Shavuos, Ushnei Yamim. Why do they put the word Omer up there? So I didn't see this, but Lanias Daiti, I think this is a remez to Rabbeinu Yerucham Shita, that the Yamim is the Oraisa, and the Shavuos are only rabbinic, and therefore they want to put the word Ba'omer on the part of the mitzvah that is a Torah command. Again, this is a chiddush. I did not see anyone say it, but I think that this may be the makor of that nusach. Because if you hold that everything is Rabbanan, or if you hold everything is the Oraisa, either of those two alternatives, you ought to put the word B'omer at the end of the sentence. There would be no justification for moving it to the beginning. But like Rabbeinu Yerucham, you would have a justification because you want to give a greater chashivus to the part of the mitzvah that's the Oraisa. Okay? So Mishra Hashem, tomorrow we'll try to go over what is the basis of Rabbeinu Yerucham's Shita.